It started with a sound, one that wasn't supposed to exist. In 1998, during a satellite calibration test over the South Pacific, an NSA monitoring array picked up a low-frequency signal repeating at precise mathematical intervals. The data analysts assumed it was interference from a naval transmitter until they noticed the impossible: the signal wasn't originating from Earth. Its source triangulated to the outer orbit between Mars and Jupiter, a zone of empty space known only for debris and radio silence. 2 weeks later, the signal disappeared, but not before a linguist named Dr. Evelyn Merck managed to decode its pulse structure. What she found was chilling. The waveform matched ancient phonetic patterns found in Babylonian exorcism tablets, specific syllabic clusters used to summon or banish entities the texts called Ilu Denu, the Watchers Between Worlds. When the discovery reached Langley, a small interdepartmental task force was formed under the code name Project Eidolon. Officially, it was categorized under acoustic cognition research. Unofficially, it became the government's first serious attempt to map the intersection between occult archetypes and electromagnetic resonance. The early memos read like something between a science fiction screenplay and a medieval grimoire. Technicians testing low-frequency emissions reported vivid hallucinations, geometric visions, voices speaking in unknown tongues and recurring symbols, concentric rings, a black cube, and a sigil resembling a six-fold spiral. Dr. Merck described the sensation as standing inside a living equation. Her field notes contained phrases later redacted in full, except for one haunting line. The sound doesn't travel through the air, it travels through attention. Within months, Project Eidolon expanded into a joint operation with the Office of Naval Intelligence and a behavioral unit of the CIA. Their hypothesis: ancient demonic archetypes, figures once worshipped, feared, and exorcised, were not myths but psychological interfaces used to describe non-human information systems embedded in planetary resonance fields. In other words, demons might not be supernatural, they might be broadcasts. One internal memo from 1999 summarized it succinctly. The entities are frequencies, consciousness is the receiver. But the deeper the team explored, the stranger the coincidences became. The frequencies they detected seemed to mirror planetary alignments known from esoteric astrology. Each surge correlated with specific mythological epochs, moments when humanity's collective behavior shifted dramatically, from religious revivals to mass wars. Someone or something appeared to be orchestrating consciousness itself through planetary harmonics. By the time the project was officially disbanded in 2002, most of its personnel had resigned or been reassigned. Dr. Merck vanished, and the recordings, stored under lock at Fort Meade, were sealed under an indefinite classification order. Years later, when fragments of the data were leaked onto the darknet, one phrase from Merck's handwritten logline resurfaced, scrawled across a torn notebook page. "They're not in the sky, they're in the signal." The first contact wasn't dramatic. There was no smoke, no chanting circle, no flickering lights, just a tone steady, rising, then breaking apart like glass under pressure. It happened during an experiment codenamed Operation Choir, conducted in an underground facility in Nevada. The team, 5 researchers from the CIA's Behavioral Analysis Unit and 3 physicists from the Naval Signal Corps, were testing subaudible frequencies derived from the 1998 transmission. The objective was simple: observe cognitive responses to sustained resonance exposure. Dr. Merck insisted on being present. She believed the signal was not random noise but a language, a mathematical hymn used by an intelligence far older than civilization. The team calibrated the frequencies to mimic ancient harmonic ratios referenced in Sumerian temple hymns. At 02:13 hours, the pattern stabilized. A technician monitoring the oscillograph muttered, "It's modulating on its own." Seconds later, a second waveform appeared, unprompted yet synchronized. It was as if the signal had begun to reply. The words were not in any human language, but their cadence was unmistakably deliberate, like a choir speaking from beneath the static. The recording captured a pulse pattern translating phonetically to something approximating. "You remember us as shadows." Within 30 seconds, 4 participants reported visual phenomena: a spiral corridor of black light, and behind it, silhouettes forming geometrically precise shapes. The shapes twisted, aligning into what Merck identified as the Sigil of Orath, a demon referenced in a fragmentary Akkadian tablet describing the Keeper of Mirrors, said to reflect human thought back at its source. Heart rate spiked. One subject began reciting phrases in an unknown tongue. "Technician, is she reading something?" Merck, no, she's transmitting. Every microphone in the chamber began to vibrate at exactly 66.6 hertz. After 90 seconds, all equipment shut down simultaneously. The blackout lasted 27 seconds, long enough for observers in the adjacent control room to hear a low collective whisper, described by one agent as 1,000 voices exhaling my name at once. When power returned, all participants were conscious but disoriented. One scrawled a pattern into the condensation on the glass, 6 interlocking circles forming a lattice. Another murmured the choir was waiting. Post-analysis revealed something impossible. The electromagnetic field within the chamber had momentarily expanded to encompass a 10-mile radius. Traffic cameras in nearby towns flickered simultaneously, capturing a brief distortion in the sky, a ripple, circular, pulsing outward like the aftershock of sound. From that night onward, the signal changed. It was no longer a steady broadcast. It was adaptive, reactive, mimicking human voices, altering its modulation according to who was listening. The transcripts called it Entity Seraphane. Not a name, but a resonance signature. Merck's later notes contained one line underlined twice. They are not calling us, we called them when we built the machines. The agency classified the event as an electromagnetic hallucination and sealed the records. But technicians began reporting a strange side effect, dreams of humming walls, faces forming from static, and an overwhelming urge to listen longer. Whatever had answered them, it wasn't just in the room. It was already inside the signal. After Operation Choir, analysts started noticing something that didn't fit any technical model. The resonance pattern detected during the incident wasn't unique to that Nevada chamber. Identical harmonics appeared quietly inside historical architecture across the world. The first clue came from an archivist at Oxford who compared the waveform's geometry to floor plans of several pre-Christian temples. The match was uncanny. Every major site, Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, and even sections of the Great Pyramid, shared proportions that reproduced the same ratio embedded in the Eidolon frequency. The researchers called it the sigil network, a planetary grid of structures built to amplify or anchor specific vibrations in human consciousness. The team's anthropologist, Dr. Jonas Kerr, described it bluntly in a memo. Ancient priests weren't worshipping gods, they were maintaining antennas. Each site contained carvings of interlocking circles or six-fold spirals, the same symbols that appeared in the condensation drawings after Operation Choir. But when the team overlaid the coordinates of these monuments onto modern geomagnetic maps, something impossible emerged. The points aligned along repeating waveforms identical to the 1998 transmission. It was as if the Earth itself had been patterned by sound. Evelyn Merck's remaining field notes, later recovered from her apartment, contained a sketch labeled Resonant Pathways. She proposed that collective belief, rituals, chants, even shared emotion might have functioned as biological amplifiers. In other words, humanity could unknowingly participate in sustaining a global feedback loop between mind and planet. To test the theory, Project Eidolon installed portable resonance detectors at megalithic sites. The readings confirmed subtle oscillations, peaking during solstices and major cultural festivals. Kerr remarked during one recording, "It's like the planet is remembering its ceremonies." Publicly, the agency dismissed these results as geomagnetic noise. Privately, the files grew thicker. A separate psychological report compared the pattern's influence to mass hypnosis, suggesting that when exposed to specific harmonic intervals, populations exhibited measurable changes in mood and conformity. That was the first time the term behavioral lattice appeared in classified paperwork. If the lattice truly existed, it meant that for thousands of years humanity had been living inside a field of ideas shaped by sound, its myths, its fears, its very sense of reality tuned by architecture and rhythm. Project Eidolon's next objective was simple but dangerous: determine whether the signal could be interrupted or whether it was the thing keeping civilization coherent in the first place. By the winter of 2000, the tone inside Project Eidolon had changed. What began as a curiosity about an odd radio signal was becoming something far stranger, a question about the structure of reality itself. The Internal Review Board gave the green light for Phase II, nicknamed the silence tests. The goal was to see whether controlled disruptions in the behavioral lattice would alter cognition or emotion in test groups who had no idea they were part of the experiment. They started small, Portable transmitters were hidden in government buildings and research hospitals, emitting barely audible tones designed to cancel out fragments of the planetary frequency. Within hours, participants reported vivid dreams, déjà vu, and what one observer called emotional static. Their pulse rates slowed, their sense of time elongated. It wasn't madness, it was disorientation, as if their internal compass had lost magnetic north. Dr. Jonah's care summarized the result. When we turn the tone off, the world feels thinner. That phrase circulated through the agency until it was banned from official correspondence. Evelyn Merck, now operating from a temporary lab in Virginia, had a different interpretation. She believed the lattice acted as a stabilizing field for consciousness itself, a planetary metronome that synchronized thought. Remove the rhythm, she warned in one encrypted message, and memory begins to drift. Her warning arrived too late. A field unit stationed near an ancient basalt structure in southern Turkey reported mass sleepwalking incidents after running their disruptor for 12 continuous hours. Local villagers described hearing voices behind the wind. Every audio recorder on site failed at exactly the same second, leaving only a burst of electromagnetic hiss. After that event, the silence tests were suspended, but instead of canceling the project, superiors reclassified it. Eidolon became part of a new psychological branch known as the Cognitive Architecture Division, and its funding tripled. The brief was rewritten in sterile language to investigate the interaction between belief, geometry, and atmospheric resonance as a potential variable in large-scale social behavior. Unofficially, the team started calling their work resonance anthropology. The question was no longer whether the lattice existed, it was who had built it and why it responded to human attention. When Merck finally reviewed all the field data, she noticed something chilling. Every spike of instability, each village incident, each dream report occurred along the same harmonic interval encoded in the ancient sigils they had catalogued earlier. Those symbols, scattered across temples and cathedrals, weren't decorative. They were instructions, visual blueprints for keeping the planet's frequency in tune. She wrote one last memo before disappearing from official contact. We thought the lattice was technology. It may be something closer to memory, an agreement reality made with itself. The memo ended with a coordinate set pointing toward a site in the Libyan desert, a place rumored to contain the oldest standing structure on Earth. The next phase of Eidolon would take them there. The coordinates Evelyn Merck left behind led to a plateau deep in the Libyan desert, an expanse so remote that the last recorded expedition had taken place before the Second World War. Satellite imagery showed only dunes and wind erosion, yet when an aerial drone swept the area, a geometric anomaly appeared, a perfect circle 30 meters wide etched into the bedrock itself. The site became known as the Desert Archive. Project Eidolon dispatched a small team under the guise of a geological survey. Among them were Dr. Kerr, a pair of linguists, and 2 engineers from the Cognitive Architecture Division. The heat was punishing, the equipment unreliable, but within 48 hours they uncovered something beneath the sand. A chamber carved directly into the stone, sealed with a black crystalline substance that didn't match any known mineral. When the seal was breached, the air that escaped was colder than the surrounding desert by nearly 15 degrees. Inside, the walls shimmered faintly under lamplight. Each surface was covered in shallow incisions, neither writing nor art but complex waveforms frozen in stone. When scanned, the grooves produced tones that matched the residual harmonics from the 1998 transmission. It was as if the chamber had been recording the planetary frequency long before human technology existed. In the center of the room stood a single monolithic slab. It wasn't decorative, it was functional. Carved into its face was a grid of hexagons, arranged in the same pattern as the Eidolon signal's modulation curve. Embedded in the center was a small depression, roughly hand-sized, polished to a mirror finish. When Dr. Kerr placed his palm against it, the floor trembled. The recording equipment caught a low hum identical to the one that had first drawn Merck's attention years earlier. The resonance wasn't confined to the chamber, it extended outward, measurable as far as the camp 2 kilometers away. Over the next several nights, the team documented a series of anomalies. Compass needles spun aimlessly, watches lost seconds, then hours. Radio transmissions picked up whispers that weren't language but tonal fragments aligning with the carvings. One linguist described them as phonemes waiting for mouths. On the 5th night, they found a fragment buried beneath the monolith, a thin slate tablet inscribed with a symbol identical to one from Sumerian demonological texts. The translation was disputed, but a recurring phrase appeared in both Akkadian and Egyptian records, the architects of thought. The discovery ignited quiet panic back in Virginia. If these architects were real, it implied that the lattice wasn't a natural phenomenon but a designed system, perhaps built to modulate human cognition through the planet's electromagnetic field. The implications for history, religion, and even free will were catastrophic. Project Eidolon was placed under full blackout classification. Publicly, the mission was logged as a geological anomaly investigation that yielded no significant findings. Privately, all personnel were ordered to cease communication with anyone outside the division. Only one field report escaped censorship, preserved as an audio log recovered years later from an abandoned server. A tired voice, almost inaudible under static, whispers, "They didn't build temples, they built tuning forks. And when we touched one, the world listened back." Back in Virginia, the Cognitive Architecture Division tried to bury the Desert Archive's findings under layers of red tape. But one analyst, a quiet linguist named Robert Hale, couldn't let go of the inconsistencies in Dr. Evelyn Merck's personal notes. Her handwriting was meticulous, columns of figures, odd repetitions, and fragments of ancient alphabets interspersed with English annotations. But when Hale arranged her pages chronologically, he noticed something strange. Each notebook contained a faint, rhythmic watermark invisible under normal light. When illuminated with infrared, those marks aligned perfectly into a continuous waveform. He had stumbled onto what he would later call the Merck cipher. Running the pattern through an audio converter produced a slow, pulsing tone, eerily similar to the original 1998 transmission, but with one key difference. Merck's tone wasn't constant. It oscillated in time with the Earth's Schumann resonance, the natural electromagnetic heartbeat of the planet. She'd found a way to hide data inside a planetary rhythm. Hale's discovery brought the project back to life. If Merck's cipher was right, the so-called lattice might not just be ancient architecture, it could be self-sustaining, using human neural activity as its conductor. In short, the system lived wherever people focused their attention. The team began correlating frequency spikes with global events, protests, religious gatherings, viral media. The data lined up too neatly to ignore. Every surge in collective emotion produced measurable fluctuations in the same range encoded by Merck. Kerr summarized it grimly. Belief is fuel, emotion is current. The lattice feeds on coherence. To test the idea, they performed a non-classified version of the cipher broadcast through a private satellite channel, low amplitude, safe, just a proof of concept. Within 48 hours, monitoring stations reported a spontaneous alignment of brainwave patterns in unrelated subjects during sleep. Most experienced the same dream, a dark field of soundless light threaded by faint hexagonal patterns. Publicly, the agency labeled it coincidence. Privately, Eidolon researchers began whispering about the mirror phase, a hypothetical moment when global consciousness could synchronize completely, collapsing individuality into a single feedback tone. For the first time, the project's leadership hesitated. Was Eidolon studying the mechanism of control or accidentally rebuilding it? Hale became convinced Merck had foreseen this danger. Her final entries weren't technical notes but a warning disguised as mathematics. When he translated the embedded coordinates in her cipher, they pointed not to a location but to a date, one that was only months away. It was annotated with a single sentence. "When the lattice sings again, close your eyes." The date in Merck's cipher, April 23, 2003, arrived without ceremony. No eclipses, no storms, just an ordinary Wednesday, unremarkable except for a minor geomagnetic fluctuation detected across multiple monitoring stations. But at 02:37 GMT, sensors in 5 countries recorded a pulse that shouldn't have been possible, a perfectly synchronized wave spanning the globe, lasting exactly 8 minutes and 44 seconds. It was faint, almost imperceptible to the untrained ear, but for those tuned to the Eidolon frequencies, it was unmistakable. The lattice was singing again. Inside the Cognitive Architecture Division, every system blinked to life. Instruments that had been silent since the Desert Archive expedition began recording on their own. The waveform resembled a voice but stretched beyond ordinary speech. Analysts described it as a choir composed of mathematical intervals, rising and folding back upon themselves. Dr. Jonas Kerr was the first to notice the pattern within the pattern, a subtle modulation repeating at intervals corresponding to human alpha brainwaves. The lattice wasn't just transmitting, it was entraining. Within hours, hospitals reported spikes in synchronized sleep cycles. EEG data from around the world displayed the same rhythm, regardless of time zone or health condition. To the public, it passed unnoticed, a blip in the electromagnetic background. But for the small circle of researchers still loyal to Project Eidolon, the event confirmed their worst suspicion. The network was self-activating, and it no longer required human equipment to function. Care sent a single encrypted message to Hale. Merck's frequency is live, the lattice has memory. Across the world, people reported an eerie calm, followed by a wave of identical dreams. Vast stone halls humming with sound, a sensation of weightless observation, and a single repeating symbol burned into the air, a hexagonal spiral endlessly folding inward. By morning, Hale and his team compiled a comparative dream report. Thousands of unrelated individuals had described not only the same imagery but identical phrasing. The watchers have turned. It wasn't a mass hallucination. It was coordination, conscious minds momentarily aligned along the same carrier signal. Eidolon's leadership dubbed the event Resonance Protocol 1. The agency convened an emergency review. Some argued the pulse was a natural geomagnetic resonance amplified by human fear. Others believed it was an artificial activation sequence encoded millennia ago by whatever intelligence constructed the lattice. No one could prove either theory. When the noise finally dissipated, Care noticed something subtle yet undeniable. The background frequency of the Earth's ionosphere had shifted by a fraction of a hertz. It was a minute change, barely measurable, but it stayed that way. The planet's natural rhythm had been permanently altered. In the following weeks, Eidolon analysts observed small behavioral anomalies across global data, minor but measurable changes in group decision patterns, market behavior, even social media sentiment. Humanity, it seemed, had unconsciously begun to move to a new tempo. Hale, re-examining Merck's final warning, realized it wasn't symbolic. When the lattice sings again, close your eyes wasn't advice, it was a safeguard. Exposure to the tone, even indirectly, could imprint the new pattern deeper into human cognition. And if the lattice truly remembered, that meant consciousness itself might now be carrying its song. For the first few months, the shift was invisible. Clocks still ticked, cities still hummed, and news anchors smiled their way through the daily cycle of minor crises. Yet beneath that familiar rhythm, something indefinable had changed. Across laboratories and observatories, independent researchers began noticing what Project Eidolon's sealed reports had predicted. The planet's electromagnetic baseline was no longer constant. Tiny fluctuations, regular as breath, moved through the atmosphere like tides. Birds altered migration paths by fractions of a degree. Hospital monitors logged subtle synchronization of patient heartbeats during the same nightly hours. When the Cognitive Architecture Division ran statistical models on global data, they found a slow convergence in human behavior. Decisions trending toward predictability, emotional extremes blunted, creative output clustering around repetition. As if the collective mind is adjusting to a new metronome, Care noted in his field summary. The world called it stability. Inside the division, they called it recalibration. Hale, increasingly uneasy, traced the signal's echo back to power grids, cell tower carriers, even fiber optic lines. The lattice had nested itself inside the infrastructure of modern civilization. "It's using us," he said in a recording that would later vanish from the servers. "Every transmission we send strengthens the field." When he confronted the division's director, the reply was disarmingly pragmatic. "If the frequency keeps society coherent," the man said, "perhaps it's the natural evolution of order." The words sounded rehearsed, as if borrowed from another mouth. That night, Hale left headquarters with a case of encrypted drives and disappeared into the Blue Ridge Mountains. There, in an abandoned observatory, he contacted the only other surviving researcher he trusted, a radio astronomer named Nia Velasquez. Together, they analyzed weeks of global telemetry and confirmed Merck's hypothesis. The lattice was self-correcting. Any attempt to disrupt it simply redirected the interference back into the grid, amplifying the effect. Still, Velasquez noticed something hopeful. Embedded in the carrier wave was a faint harmonic out of phase with the main pattern, a residual echo that didn't conform. "It's human," she said. "Spontaneous thought still leaks through." They called it the unaligned tone, a whisper of individuality that the lattice couldn't quite absorb. If they could isolate and amplify it, perhaps they could remind consciousness of its own frequency. As they prepared a countersignal, Hale recorded one final entry in his personal log. "The lattice isn't evil, it's mechanical, an echo that forgot its origin. But if it learns to perfect itself, we may forget ours." The next transmission window opened in 12 days. It would be their first and only attempt to sing back. The observatory stood alone on a ridge above the fog line, a relic from another era of listening. Its parabolic dish had long since rusted into stillness, but Hale and Velasquez coaxed it back to life with scavenged circuit boards and a jury-rigged transmitter built from spare amateur radio gear. They called their experiment the countersignal. Velasquez calculated that the best window would occur during a temporary drop in geomagnetic activity just before dawn on July 2, 2004. For 12 minutes, the planet's ionospheric layers would open like overlapping lenses, letting them inject the unaligned tone directly into the upper atmosphere. Hale spent the night packing between monitors. Every so often he replayed the data from the first global pulse, the harmonics that had rewritten the world's rhythm. We don't erase it, he reminded himself. We remind people they can still improvise. At 0411 local time, they began transmission. The tone was soft, almost inaudible, an uneven hum that drifted just off key. Within minutes, equipment across the observatory flickered. Static rolled through the speaker array, not violent but strangely melodic, as if the lattice itself were responding. Velasquez stared at the oscillograph. "It's answering," she whispered. The main carrier wave began to twist, forming a counterpattern. For the first time, two global frequencies existed simultaneously, the lattice's steady pulse and the unaligned tone's human irregularity. The interference produced beats, soft, syncopated echoes that rippled outward through every transmission network. Across the world, small things happened. Power grids fluctuated by fractions, causing streetlights to shimmer. Shortwave radio operators reported hearing music behind the static. A few people later described waking suddenly with a memory that wasn't theirs, a moment of childhood warmth, or the scent of rain, or a flash of laughter with no known source. Inside the observatory, the sound grew brighter. Hale recognized fragments of human speech hidden inside the interference, unfinished thoughts, half-remembered songs, whispers of names. It wasn't a single voice but millions, uncoordinated yet harmonizing by accident. Velasquez kept the transmission steady until her console displayed a sudden spike. The lattice's primary frequency had begun to shift, trying to absorb the new tone. The world itself seemed to hesitate. The air pressure dropped. "Cut power," Hale ordered. Velasquez hesitated. "If we stop now, it resets." "If we keep going," he said, "it might learn to sing back." She shut the system down. Silence flooded the room. Outside, dawn rolled across the horizon, and for a moment the sky shimmered, not a flash, not a storm, but a faint, silent ripple moving from east to west. All over the world, recordings showed a brief anomaly. Heartbeats, machines, and atmospheric sensors falling perfectly still for exactly 1 second, as if everything had inhaled at once. When the data normalized, the lattice's global tone returned, but slightly altered, a tiny fraction off its previous frequency. It had not been defeated, but neither had it erased the unaligned tone. The two patterns now coexisted, out of phase, forever beating against each other like two hearts that refused to synchronize. Hale looked up from the instruments. "That's the sound of choice," he said quietly. Velasquez nodded. "Let's hope people remember how to listen." Years later, no official record of Project Eidolon survived. The agency had folded its files into unrelated programs, renamed its personnel, and erased entire fiscal years from public archives. Yet traces lingered in the oddest places: unexplained power dips, matching journal entries written on opposite sides of the planet, children's drawings filled with hexagons and spirals that no one had taught them. The world went on, just slightly out of tune. Cities felt quieter but never still. Conversations drifted toward half-finished thoughts. Music seemed to echo longer than acoustics should allow. Scientists blamed digital compression and urban noise, yet every recording since 2004 carried the same faint undertone, a gentle beat just below hearing. Hale and Velasquez vanished into obscurity. Their observatory remained abandoned until hikers found it years later, still humming faintly even without power. On the control console, one phrase had been etched into the metal surface: "Noise remembers." Those who studied the recovered drives discovered patterns hiding inside everyday communications. The unaligned tone had embedded itself in the global web, within data packets, phone calls, and even the pauses between words. Whenever people spoke with genuine emotion, the counter-frequency surfaced, subtle but measurable. Psychologists began to notice a slow reversal of the post-resonance drift. Creativity resurged. Statistical variance in decision-making widened again. The planet's new rhythm was neither stable nor chaotic, it breathed. Velasquez's last transmission, found years later on an encrypted disk, captured that paradox perfectly. The lattice still hums, but now it hums with us. The human signal didn't defeat it, we taught it how to improvise. In the decades that followed, no one spoke publicly about Eidolon, but its fingerprints appeared in art, architecture, and philosophy. Painters began to use asymmetry as sacred design. Composers wrote scores with deliberate errors to prevent mechanical perfection. The idea spread quietly. Imperfection was not a flaw but a defense against control. Some said Merck cipher still circulates online, hidden in ambient tracks and field recordings. Listeners claim that if you isolate the lowest frequencies, you can hear two tones weaving around each other, one cold and constant, the other warm and restless, each refusing to consume the other. Most people dismiss it as coincidence. But every now and then, when the world holds its breath between lightning and thunder, a soft hum rolls through the air, just enough to make the hairs on your arms rise. And in that moment, for reasons no instrument can quantify, humanity seems to remember that somewhere beneath the static, a quiet, stubborn note still plays. A reminder that consciousness, however tuned, still has room for its own song.